That night, I noticed Paul seemed sad. I asked if he was okay, but he didn't say anything. He just walked away. And me being silly, I started to sing, "I wanna know how Paul is." But this time, he didn't turn around. He just kept walking. And had I known that this would be the last time I would see Paul, I would have done things much differently. I met Paul 5 years ago in band class. We had the same interests and he loved to play the saxophone. We were just two little weird scrubs that loved music. He was one of those guys who you could laugh and joke around with. He was a little nerdy and had his quirks, but that's what made him special. Paul allowed you to see that side of him. He made you feel like you could be yourself no matter how awkward or weird you thought you were. He made you feel normal and he made you feel wanted. I cherished his friendship. He introduced me to the game Minecraft. We would stay up late on Skype while we played Minecraft together. During those calls, we would talk about everything, band, school, and other kids. I told him about my passion for writing and he encouraged me to actually finish a story. The story I wrote was trash, but he didn't care. Every day at lunch, he would ask me if I wrote anything new, and if I tried to say that I had writer's block, he told me I needed to get through it and keep writing. When I finished the story, he grabbed the journal and read it all. I lived for that moment. I don't think he understood the joy he gave me when he read my story. I started to write more, just so he could read my stories. Sometimes he would give his honest opinion, which hurt when he gave negative criticism, but it was so helpful. Freshman year was my happiest year, and Paul contributed to that completely. But in sophomore year, things took a scary turn. That's the thing with depression and stuff like that. You never really know how long the person is struggling with it until it becomes such a burden that it slips through the cracks. At first, it was small things. His moods were more sour than sweet most days. He didn't want to talk about his problems or even acknowledge that he was dealing with something. Every day after school, he would pick me up in his old, rusty pickup truck and drive me to the sophomore parking lot so I wouldn't have to walk. A lot of those times, he would park in the parking lot and we would just talk for ages. Sometimes I would be able to get him to open up about what's bothering him, and those times he would go into detail. But other days, he would be so vague. It still meant a lot to me that he was willing to talk to me about his problems, and I tried my best to make him feel better in any way that I could, but I always felt that I wasn't really helping him. I felt like he didn't want my help, or any help for that matter. It wasn't until spring break of sophomore year that he told me he didn't want to live anymore. It was the most heart-wrenching text I had ever gotten. "What do you think would happen if I wasn't here anymore?" My first response was to be angry. I mean, how could he think like that? Didn't he know that so many people would miss him? How could he be so selfish? But then another thought popped into my head. What if he's planning on doing something right now? I didn't know what to do. I was miles away and there was nothing I could do except try and calm him down until I got home. It was one of the most stressful weeks of my life. If he took too long to reply to my messages, my mind would constantly jump to the worst conclusion. As soon as I got home from vacation, I went to my band director who told me to go straight to the counselor. I told the school counselor everything about what had been going on. She told me that everything would be okay and that she would speak to Paul and call his parents. I didn't know if I was making the right decision, but I knew I had to do something, anything to help him get better. He was going to the counselor right after class. I was sure he knew that I had said something. I was afraid he would be furious with me like I betrayed his trust in some way. When lunch came around, I saw him sitting at our usual table. I sat across from him. My stomach dropped as he looked up at me, gave me a weak smile, and said, "I know it was you who went to the counselor." "Please don't be mad," I whispered back. He went on to tell me how he wasn't mad and that he probably needed that visit with the counselor. Later that night, he finally spoke with his mom and told her everything. After a while, I became so tired of being around someone who thought so negatively. I felt like I had done all I could do and couldn't handle the strain he put on my heart. How do you help someone who refused to admit that something was wrong? I know none of these are good excuses, but at the time, it was all that I had to keep sane. I kept making excuses to not hang out with him, and to be honest, I didn't think he cared enough about me to get hurt about not hanging out. Until he texted me one day saying, "I feel like you're trying to avoid me." I felt horrible by what I had done. How could I have let our friendship come to that? I knew he needed help, but when it got hard for me, I gave up. I hated thinking that I left him alone in his dark thoughts, and maybe all he needed was a little light, an escape. Maybe I was that escape. But I'll never know. Junior year comes around and everything seems all right. He had his moods at times, but other than that, he seemed happy. It was homecoming night. The band marched and the football team played. It felt like finally school would get better. But I noticed that Paul wasn't acting like himself. Normally, I would have just made a mental note in my head to ask him about it the next day, but something told me that I had to go talk to him. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I'm fine, it's nothing." "I know that's not true, Paul. You know you can tell me anything, right? Even if you don't want me to say anything, I'm here if you need someone to vent to." "I know, and thank you for that. I'm just having problems with myself," Paul said as he walked away. Me being silly, I started saying, "I want to know how Paul is." But this time, he didn't turn around. He just kept walking. If I had known that was the last time I would ever see him again, I would have tried to do things differently. I woke up to a text from my friend who was freaking out over a text Paul sent her earlier that morning. Little did I know that this would become the worst day of my life. I showed the message to my mom, who told me that he was probably being dramatic. It sounded mean at the time, but I know now that she was just trying to keep me calm. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to go to Paul's house to make sure he was okay. I went to go pick up my friend, and as I approached her house, I should have known what had happened, but a part of me didn't want to believe it. A cop was there to talk to her, which I assumed was because they had sent cops to go check on Paul. I didn't know he was already gone. My friend got a call from someone's mom who worked at the hospital, and that's how we found out. I remember the world seemed to break apart. I don't remember hitting the floor. I just remember realizing I fell on the ground and broke down in sobs. It wasn't crying, it was more wailing. The tears came later, as if my body couldn't even handle the news completely. Not knowing what else to do, I called my mom. I was hysterical, which freaked her out. "He's gone, Mom! He's gone!" I wailed in between sobs. I think it took her a second to realize what I meant. "Oh no, baby, where are you? Where are you right now?" That day was a blur of tears. The worst part was having to call our friends to let them know what had happened to Paul. To hear my friend's pain and sadness was 10 times worse than my own. I went to one of my friend's house, and I remember we just held each other. Our world just fell apart, and that was all we could do. Hold each other and cry our sadness out together. I didn't sleep that night, or the next few nights. How could I? My best friend was no longer alive. The one person who had been a huge part of my life for 5 years suddenly wasn't there anymore. For the longest time, I felt empty. I had failed my best friend because when he needed me the most, I pushed him away. He died the day before my birthday. It felt like God was saying, "This is your fault, so here's your punishment for letting this happen to him, for not doing more." What hurt me even more is that I will never know how Paul thought of me in his last moments. I'm always going to wonder if he knew how much I still loved him after everything that happened between us. I don't think what happened really hit me until I went to his memorial service. I couldn't imagine a world where Paul wasn't in it. The memorial service made it a reality. Seeing his body in that coffin was more than my soul could handle. When my mom and I were in the lobby, my mom was talking to someone and I was left alone with my feelings. Some of Paul's belongings were laid out, and what took me over the edge was seeing his Letterman jacket lying next to his saxophone. I had sat in his car with him just a few weeks before, and I remember seeing that jacket laying on the back seat of his car. Such a small thing broke my heart because I realized at that moment that was it. From that point forward, all I would have from him were memories. No new adventures or conversations. Nothing. I felt like my knees were going to give away, and I told my mom that I needed to leave. My relationship with Paul was one of the highlights of my life growing up. He had so many good times, and I hate that he ended it so soon. I wish I had done things differently. I wish the school had done things differently too. Paul went to only one counseling session. I wish the school would have paid more attention to him and followed up with him after the initial counseling. I'm not putting the blame on the school, but I think it's important that schools do more to help students struggling with depression and other issues. I would give anything to have him back in my life again. Anything. It's weird to think that anything positive could come out of something so dark, but for me, that's the case. My friendships have grown stronger and I've gained a new appreciation for life. Because now, I know how precious human life is and how complex depression can be. I know that the words I say to people can have a life-changing impact. I know now that how I treat others matters. So, if you take anything away from this, please know that your actions, the way you talk to others, has an impact on the people around you. If you see someone struggling with something, lend a hand. It may end up being the lifeline that is the only thing keeping them here. And if you are struggling with depression or think that no one cares about what you're going through, you are wrong. So many people in your life love you and care for you. Your sadness is not permanent. As Paul said in his last message on this world, you are beautiful, wonderful, and important.